Mrs. Plummer and Jessie, if I may, thank you both for coming along here this morning. As you know, we're a bit short on time, so I'm just going to dive straight in and ask a couple of questions. You don't both need to answer every one. So perhaps Jessie could just tell me why so many patients living in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire are registered with Welsh GPs.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank the committee for taking this testimony. I mean, I come at this from a very kind of constituency representative position, not remotely. I don't have a political agenda about this, but I do have a serious issue, which is that I have a lot of constituents. There are about 3,500 in Herefordshire overall who live along the border and who are registered with Welsh GPs. And in almost all cases, they don't have a choice about that. It's because their nearest GP is in Wales, and very often, actually, local other GPs will not accept them on their rolls. And the difficulty with that has come because in some cases, those people are then not being given the rights they're entitled to as English residents under the English NHS. And the classic example would be one of my constituents who was looking for a nuchal scan. She was pregnant. She lives in Herefordshire. She wanted to have her baby in Hereford Hospital, which has got a very good maternity unit. I mean, as do other hospitals. And it's one of those things where you have a narrow time to get the scan. You have to have it between 11 weeks, 2 days, and 14 weeks, 1 day. And essentially what happened was that she missed her scan. And that's just one example of many other ones.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit.
Sure.
Others will forgive me. But we saw a letter, it's in our pack, from the Health Minister, saying that in future she had given an instruction that English patients registered with Welsh GPs would have, by guarantee, whatever standards apply in England. So that is officially, as far as I can tell, government policy as of a few weeks ago. Am I right or wrong in saying that?
Right, yes.
I mean, I should just say, if I may just follow up for a second, then of course Pam will speak. In her letter, it looks as though that applies to primary care.
Right.
A lot of the concerns we have relate to secondary care. Different waiting times between the Welsh NHS and the English NHS, access to the Cancer Drugs Fund. There's a whole suite of rights that people have that they're entitled to as English residents. And the question is, should they get them? Right. And if I could just say one final question, which is final sense, which is the worry. I think there's a worry from a government standpoint, which is that actually, if it doesn't honour the rights in full, it's potentially open to legal challenge, judicial review, and criticism. And I think it wants to avoid that.
Mrs. Plummer, sure.
Going back to the original question, the reason that we've got so many of our residents in Gloucestershire registered with Welsh registered GPs is historic, because when they registered with them years ago, and lots of people lived in the village for decades, there was a UK National Health Service. Secondly, it's about accessibility, because we live in a rural area. It's about the local GP. Thirdly, same as Jessie, absolutely no choice. There are no other English GP surgeries who will take you because of the home visits, although that has eased very recently because of what an Bone Health did. Uniquely in Gloucester, there are 7 GP practices affected, and 3 of those surgeries are actually physically in England. So, for example, when I moved to Gloucestershire from Monmouthshire, I have to say, to Gloucestershire, I registered with my local GP in 2002. It was a UK National Health Service, and I lived in England, my surgery was in England. Why would I bang on the door and ask them if they're Welsh? You don't. You just don't think that's the case.
I didn't know you were a constituent at some point.
Oh, did you?
Okay.
Yes. So, essentially, your patients who are living in England, residents in England, but are registered then with a Welsh GP.
Yes.
When it then comes to secondary services, it's the Welsh NHS that's paying. Do you think it would be easier if it were the English NHS that paid, and that might circumvent some of the delays that you've experienced?
We would like to see the money channelled for secondary care through to Gloucester Clinical Commissioning Group, because that will solve a lot of the issues around representation and around consultation and about our legal rights. If Gloucester CCG were able to commission, which they should actually, as it stands, be able to do, because their own constitution says they commission for the whole of Gloucestershire. In fact, they don't. They commission for most of them. Then we would be able to hold Gloucester Clinical Commissioning Group to account for all the decisions that they make through our democratically representatives. And at the moment, the way it is organised at the moment, an Iron Bevan Health Board do a commission, and they are absolutely unaccountable for their actions through any democratic process. We have no representation in Wales whatsoever. The Community Health Council isn't allowed to represent us because we live in England. Health Watch has no powers because we're treated as if we live in Wales. Gloucester CCG are sympathetic but powerless. And we have no means of complaining or objecting to anything that Norrie and Bevan Health do, which is why we ended up in a mess over a year ago when they introduced their out-of-area referral policy, which prevented us from accessing secondary care in England.
I mean, to be fair to the Iron Bevan Health Board, you know, there has been lobbying on it, they have listened to it, and they've put in place a temporary arrangement, but I don't think anyone thinks that's a durable long-term arrangement. It only applies to certain trusts that they work with. I just add one thing, which is there is another anomaly, which is that Welsh patients who are registered with English GPs do have all the rights that they get under the English NHS. So there is the parallel, as it were, unfairness the other way as well.
Who pays for them? Is their secondary treatment paid for by the Welsh Health Board or by the English commissioning group?
I mean, I don't know what the financial arrangements are, but I think the principle is clear, which is that the money should follow the rights, if you see what I mean, and that means that people on both sides would have to get sorted out either way.
We'll have to find out.
But what I'm focusing on is the rights, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
I think you covered most of it, but obviously the Iron Bevan, as you say, initially said no, you know, we'd have to look at every single one. Then they said, you know, the 4 that you could go to. How much communication was there with patients and GPs about the new arrangements? You could go to specific hospitals but not to others. And do you think there is more that ought to be done in that respect?
Do you mean as it is now, or do you mean what happened a year
Well,
ago?
initially it was 2012, wasn't it?
Yes.
They said you couldn't go, but then in September 2013 they said that, you know,
Go to some,
specific named hospitals that.
Well, in 2012, we wrote to Norrie and Bevan Health Board and we had 2 letters back, one on the 18th of April and one on the 20th of June. And in those letters, they defended their consultation process and said it was extensive. It was extensive, but not for Gloucestershire. There were no adverts in the local press, only in the Welsh press. One person from Gloucester PCT attended one meeting, Sarah Hughes. Gloucester PCT was in the middle of being unravelled because of the reorganisations within England, so there really wasn't any consultation whatsoever within Gloucestershire. In terms of how people found out that they couldn't access services, I personally found out because my friend rang me up and they said he said I can't go to England for my hearing treatment anymore, and I said why, and he said because Wales won't allow us to refer to England anymore, and I said in my naivety 18 months ago, what's it got to do with Wales? Because I had no knowledge of this system or how it worked. So in terms of when they changed their policy, it was partly because of a public outcry. It wasn't just a rethink. We had a public meeting, 270 people came to that meeting. We had 800 people sign a petition. We personally delivered over 2,000 leaflets. Our MP, Jessie Norman, helped as well. All parish councils got involved, district councillors, and there was a public outcry about what was happening because people's care were being jeopardised to such a degree. That has been sorted out now, but it doesn't represent a permanent solution. And Iron Bevan on paper, as things stand, could change their mind at any time they like, and we could go back to that in 5 years' time. It also denies us our legal rights under the NHS Constitution and the Health and Social Care Act, which we always believed to be the case, but Miss Ellison, the Department of Health, have now actually confirmed to be the case. So we are now in a situation where we feel we're not being treated lawfully.
I mean, Pam puts it very well. If I could just add a very quick grace note, it is this, that in Herefordshire, where we had a similar outcry, 3 of the cases that I've cited, which relate to eye care denied, an MRA scan, antenatal scans, all occurred after the change in policy. So not only was it evidently not particularly well communicated with, but actually it wasn't clear that they were following the policy even within the system after the change had been announced and supposedly promulgated.
Yeah, we've heard from you, Mr. Norman, that you've got constituents who are living in England who've got no option of registering with an English GP. They're required to register with a Welsh GP, but even though they live in England, the money for their treatment is paid by Wales. Now, do you think it would be better if if their treatment was paid for by the English NHS in order that they could make the sort of demands and representations you want where they're treated, namely in the Welsh NHS.
I mean, if I may, I'm not going to get drawn on that, only because the financial arrangements between the Welsh and English NHS are so complicated and across so many different areas, secondary care, primary care, ambulance, that an equitable settlement needs to be drawn up between the two. I'm really just insisting on the very obvious and boring point, which is that if people live in England and have no choice but to use a Welsh GP, they should maintain their rights under the English NHS. They are owed that duty of care. And I think there's a parallel case for Welsh patients who are in the other situation.
But we heard from the previous witnesses that obviously there's various commissioning arrangements between England and Wales where, you know, a health trust in Wales will pay England or vice versa for according to where they send their patients. So that seems to work. And it seems to follow from that in principle that if you're a person coming from England into Wales, the money should follow the patient, and it doesn't. And surely that would be part of the solution. And why aren't you pressing for that?
Well, as far as I understand it, that is the general principle. Of course, the tariff arrangements often don't work at all well. In Hereford Hospital, we have tariff. We've always had served Welsh patients all the way up to Rhaeadr and Landod, and often the tariff is actually inadequate for the work that's done and paid late. So I think there's a range of issues, and I'd like a consolidated solution to how these overall issues are addressed as such.
Shouldn't English residents who have registered with Welsh GPs pay their own prescription charges if if they want to have English standards of English waiting times, then aren't people getting their cake and eating it at the moment? They're getting the free prescriptions, but they're demanding English standards on waiting times.
I think I see the force of the argument. I just don't know enough about the financial arrangements to comment. I would say these are people who are forced to use these GPs. These are not people who are doing it as a matter of, as it were, choice in order to avail themselves of free prescription charges.
Can you just explain a bit more why the GPs won't take you?
It's because of practice boundaries. It's because of the locality. They have to do home visits. They won't cross the line to do home visits because it costs them money. And we only can access Welsh GPs until very recently, after the public outcry. One GP practice in Lydney increased its boundary to take 500 more people. Well, that's not going to help the 6,000 people if they want to get to an English GP. So we are locked into a situation where there's an absolute monopoly on us. There's nowhere else to go.
So there's no patient choice?
Absolutely, not even at the level of GP, which actually goes against the NHS constitution as well, because you're supposed to be able to choose a GP. And so we're stuck, and there's nothing we can do about it. When the out-of-area referral policy came in, that was recognised by Norwich Bevan Health Board in their board minutes, where they actually commented that we couldn't move, that therefore their GP practices were at a low risk of being destabilised.
And you mentioned there have been some changes in the boundaries. How have you achieved those?
Sir David Nicholson wrote to the GPs, English GPs locally apparently, and then he confirmed to us that this GP had opened its boundaries. But again, that hasn't been particularly communicated to English patients. So if you do need to move, most people don't even know about Lydney. We are actually doing leaflet drops on behalf of the NHS, telling people what's going on.
And are you lobbying NHS England to...
Yes, we've had meetings with NHS England in July, and we've been exchanging emails ever since. In fairness to Mr Stevens, he has asked us to be involved in any, the proposal communicated with us, but we're having quite a job trying to get NHS England to tell us, first of all, what our legal rights were, which is why we asked our MP, Mark Harper, to go to the Department of Health and get a statement, because NHS England wouldn't tell us. They kept telling us they didn't know and it was complicated, and then the last email said, we'll tell you when we've implemented it. So we were about to say, sorry, but we'd really like to know anyway. And when we got the letter from Jane Ellison, which solved the problem.
Well, of course, I don't share Pam's view it has solved the problem, because it only addresses the issue of primary care, and it doesn't actually reflect a settled agreement between the two NHSs, Welsh and English, and that's what we want. I also have lobbied the English NHS on this issue. Let me just give you an example. Patty Fender, local campaigner, well known to Pam and myself, lives in Welsh Newton, has applied to be tended in Much Birch, supported by Much Birch Surgery and the one in Ross-on-Wye, and both have said no. And the result is she has no primary care because she's not She was with the Monmouth GP, but she's asserting her rights under the English NHS, and I think she's perfectly entitled.
Okay.
Can I just say, I don't see it as a
Pamela first, then Geraint, and then Simon.
Sorry.
It's clear. Are you saying, I mean, I'd agree with this, but that are you saying that someone living in England should have the right to register with an English GP because they live in England? And secondly, if they are to be registered in Wales, they should have the money following them from England into Wales to pay for that service to deliver, you know, the expectations they have from living in England?
In theory, yes, I think we have the right to have an English GP, and NHS England should be providing that. All I can say is when we held our public meeting and 270 people came to it, people said to us they really like their Welsh GPs. The issue is not their GPs. Their GPs are great.
I just wondered.
So they're happy to stay with their Welsh GPs. They just want their rights for secondary healthcare under the NHS
But that should be paid
Constitution.
for by England. This is the point I'm trying to make.
I'm not an expert on the money, so I would have thought logically yes.
I mean,
Because it makes sense.
These areas are very large. It's not actually realistic in many cases to ask someone, even if the GPs were to open up their lists, it's not actually realistic in many cases.
No,
to
it's
ask
not.
them.
It's just the money follows.
If the money follows the patient,
Follows
that's
the
a different,
people.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But you would go along with that.
You want
you
a
get the
situation in
standards,
my area really where you can stay with your GP who you know, they treat you well, you know, they know your family, their background, there's a good relationship, and then they just access NHS England secondary healthcare, and the commissioning is done in Gloucester, we feel, so that it's safe, it's protected, and it's all as clear as a bell. Gloucester commissioned for 620,000 people, another 6,000 isn't going to make any difference.
I'll bring some now, but just to be clear about this, you both agree that the money should follow the patient around, broadly speaking.
Yes, that makes sense.
Albeit that it's complicated, but in
Yeah.
simple terms. Right.
By the way, I'm not contesting that, but I do think that general principle, which is the one the NHS adopts, has got to be weighed against issues of fairness in the overall balance. Because we have a system that actually is not fair and reflects on both sides of the border, and that needs a consolidated discussion.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Well,
But basically, the money should follow the patient.
but I think let's not. I think there's almost some consensus there. So on that happy note,
Yes. What would your constituents and friends and neighbours think if they were listening to this debate now? With devolution being all the rage, what would they be? Do they think devolution has been to the benefit of healthcare in the border counties?
Are you asking me as a...
I'm asking both, really.
Well, I mean, from a constituency standpoint, they don't, as I think has been testified, often understand the difference, and they don't care about the difference. What they want is good local health care and the rights that they believe they're entitled to in virtue of where they live to be observed.
Okay, before I come back to Pamela, to ask the same question in a different way, assuming that they now do know because they are watching this or they read the transcript or you inform them of, with much discussion about further powers to the Welsh Assembly going down the line. That seems to be a subject which never goes away. How do you think they would react to that? I mean, they thinking.
I mean, let's be clear.
I'll tell you why I'm saying this. I just think that there's a real sense of frustration, I think, emerging from this.
Look. There's huge. Let's be clear. There's huge frustration, and there's a great sense of injustice. And I'm taking the view that the committee understands that, and therefore I'm not going on about it now. Now, they might well have criticisms about the arrangements that were reached as a result of devolution because of that, but that's not really the basis on which I'm making the argument that I'm making. I'm making an argument about the unintended consequences of a specific set of circumstances rather than the in principle question of whether it was right to have that.
Fine, but what I suppose I'm saying, sorry, I keep doing camera here, what I'm I suppose saying is that we have opportunities on the political sort of horizon to possibly rectify some of these, and if so, how would we do it? Because everything you've told us so far, if I was just waiting for my care, and I was living in the border counties, I'd be thinking, I'd be thinking sort of things that Hansard don't want me to think. But I would really be wondering. It would confirm all my worst views, if you like, about.
Well, if you want to get really angry about it, you would look at the difference in ambulance crossings. 186 Welsh ambulances, English going into Wales, 16 Wales going into England. Now, if you wanted to get angry about things, you might get angry about that.
Absolutely.
But those are not. That's okay. I don't think that's absolutely germane to what we're trying to talk about now, with respect.
But I'm trying to change the subject. I'm trying to make it germane. I'm trying to actually, shine a light on this a bit. I'm trying to. I suppose the question is, how can we keep highlighting problems, and perhaps let's pass the ball a little bit to Pamela, because I think how do we rectify this?
I think that devolution is a fact of life, and that Welsh Government is going to make its own decisions about its healthcare, and it absolutely should, because it's through its democratic representatives. What it shouldn't do is entangle English residents in your decisions. The Health and Social Care Act is really, really clear. It applies to absolutely everybody who lives in England. The cross-border protocol has overwritten that when it has no authority or mandate to do that. The legislation should stand for the English and for the Welsh governments, and you should make sure that whatever you do with devolution, you don't deny English residents their rights, because what's happened to a lot of people in Gloucester is actually awful. I've got goodness knows how many case studies of really, really poor care and appalling decisions. And I can give you examples in some generic terms of what's gone wrong. You've got Welsh patients, English residents who are registered with the Welsh GP, who are being seen by a Welsh consultant, having to jump to an English GP through a GP fix because nobody would take them. The GP himself told us personally when we met him, he was absolutely livid that he lost a patient of 20 odd years. He is now with an English GP seeing the same Welsh consultant so he can get access to rare cancer drugs. Some of the machinations...
Hang on, he's getting access to rare cancer drugs in
Wales?
England? Oh, in England.
Through his English GP, but still seeing the same Welsh consultant who couldn't get him the drugs in Wales. There's all sorts of hoops that people are leaping through.
Can you illustrate that? What sort of delays have been built into that system which wouldn't have been there had we had not?
Well, I've got a constituent who desperately needed an MRI scan, was not able to get it because of arguments about these things, and then discovered that she had a cyst on her spine. Now, she very rationally and rightly takes the view that if that MRI scan had been forthcoming, when originally requested, under her perfectly fair rights as an English patient, that might have had a meaningful impact on the diagnosis and treatment of her condition. You can imagine. So these things get very, very angry very quickly once you get into detail.
I've got Gito Garrett. I want to ask one myself, actually, probably to Mrs. Plummer. I know you have an organisation that represents English patients who are looking to have their treatment in England, or at least to English waiting time standards. But are there, as far as you're aware, patients in England who are opting to go to Wales, or who are quite happy with the service in Wales?
Some people do want to go to Wales. That's where they've gone in the past. That's where they've had their baby at Neville Hall, and they do want to cross the border, and they're quite happy to go to Wales. But that could be accommodated if you recognise the English rights, because if Gloucester Clinical Commission Group commissions, they can commission contracts in Wales for those people to still maintain that flow. So it's a no-lose situation if you do it that way.
Are there any particular services that people prefer to have in Wales, or where the standards are obviously higher? I mean, we're getting a sense that there's a kind of that there are differences in different areas. I mean, obviously people will always want to have their prescriptions for free if they can. What else?
The main problem with Wales is the waiting times. If you had an option of going to England in 4 months' time for an operation, or to Wales in 4 months' time for an operation, as you're actually entitled to, and somebody said wait 6 months, which one would you choose?
Yeah, but are there some things that perhaps you wait?
Yes, we're much closer to centres of excellence in Bristol, where we live, than we are to centres of excellence in Wales. To access those, for example, one person wanted to go to Flintshire because his son had hurt his hand. He was sent to Swansea, 75 miles away, when they wouldn't allow us to refer to England. He was, instead of being able to jump out of bed and see his son when he woke up under an anaesthetic, he was told he'd have to book a hotel in Wales, in Swansea.
So
he was told he'd have to wait much longer.
That's more of a distance issue than a
But you've also got good centres of excellence in Flintshire and at Southmead.
What about, you've got Cancer Drugs Fund, we've talked about. You've also got, the eye hospital in Hereford is national, if not world-class quality, and people aren't being able to use it.
But there must be some things that we're better at in Wales. I mean, we are the Welsh Affairs Select Committee. What are we good at in Wales?
Inevitably, I know the ones on my side of the constituencies I don't know. I mean, I can't comment about the contrast between Neville Hall and Hereford Hospital.
Okay, so Gito and then Geraint.
Clarification, you mentioned the cancer patient who was registered with the Welsh GP, seeing a consultant based in Wales, not able to access the Cancer Drugs Fund.
That's right.
He then transferred to an English-based GP, so the same Welsh consultant and was able to access the cancer drug.
That's right.
That's correct. Okay.
And people are just jumping through hoops to avoid
No,
the waiting
I
list,
just wanted to clarify
continuity
what
of
I
care.
heard.
Yep, that's an absolute case. The GP himself, we had 2 meetings with GPs in Chepstow, and that was told to us by the GP himself. So I can say that that's true.
I mean, there is another, just very quickly, there's a great note. Organ donation is something where there's a difference in policy between the two. There's deemed donation on the Welsh side, not on the English side. Yeah. I've got lots of constituents who are worried that they may have organs deemed to be donated because they're registered under Welsh GPs, although they live in England. Yes. I mean, that could be sorted out just by communication and fiat. That's not a financial thing as such, it seems to me.
Okay. Geraint.
We understand that something like 20,000 people who live in England who are registered in Wales, and 15,000 the other way round. They're basically registered in Wales and they live in Wales and registered in England. And the people who are so registered in England, if they then get treated in England, even though they're registered in Wales, the Welsh Health Service pays for the hospital treatment in England. Do you think that's something that should be changed? Because that is a very significant drain on the Welsh Health Service. This is people living in England, being treated in England, being paid for by Wales because they've chosen to register in Wales and also getting free prescriptions. Do you think that's right?
They're living in England. They're with Welsh GPs.
Yeah, but they end up being referred to England for treatment that Wales pays for. Do you think that should be changed?
I personally say that they, in many cases they have not chosen to register. They have been forced to register with a Welsh GP, and
I'm just saying,
also,
why should
but also,
Wales
I think there's but I think there's also a further question,
England?
which is you know, the general principle in the NHS recently over the last 10 years has been that there should be free choice as to where you get treated. And I'm not sure it is wise for the Welsh NHS to be constraining where people registered under it do get treated. I think it should be treated. I don't think it should be a financial matter in that sense. I think it should be they should be treated the best place where they can be
choice. Who should pay?
I think the point here is it's not about the money. How NHS England, how NHS Wales organise their money is up to the managers within the NHS. Presumably there is a pot of money at government level and that's spent on however they decide. The issue is about the legal situation based on residency. And that's the bottom line, that we are entitled to go to England. We have always been entitled to go to England since the Health and Social Care Act in 2012. We are entitled to have access to the Cancer Drug Fund. We are entitled to choose our GP, to decide how to choose and book. We can't use choose and book at the moment. We are limited to 4 trusts where an Iron Bevan has contracts. We barely won those rights when there was an argument between Iron Bevan and UBHT. They didn't pay their bills, and then a whole lot of people had their operations cancelled again. So it's the current arrangements aren't a permanent solution. They're tenuous, they're unjust, and sorting the money out shouldn't drive the solution. The solution is what's right for us, what's right for the people in Wales, and then organise your money. I don't see that we can solve the money problem here.
You may not know the answer to this, but would a Welsh patient registered with an Welsh resident registered with an English GP have access to the Cancer Drugs Fund?
Under the current protocol arrangements, yes. And they get treated in 18 weeks, and they can use choose and book, and they can do all the things, the 5 rights under the NHS Constitution, we don't have.
And that Welsh resident registered with the English GP, their treatment will be paid for by the English
I
NHS.
I don't know how the money works.
It's a bit complicated. Right, well, I'm not seeing many more questions here, so as I don't see any more questions, I will call this meeting to a close. But thank you very much indeed, both of you, but particularly, if I may say, to Mrs.
Thank you very much for listening to us. It's really, really
Kings,
kind of you. Thank you. Really grateful.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Order.